Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Theology Thursday. Today is very definitely Thursday. Today is not
Right.
Sunday.
Nope.
I am
This is the most Thursday I have felt in years.
I am joined, as always, by my inimitable colleague, the Reverend James Smith, who is pastor of St. John Lutheran Church in Three Rivers and rector of Trinity Episcopal Church, also in Three Rivers. And today we are very pleased to welcome our friend and colleague, Rabbi Simone Schicker of Temple B'nai Yisrael. I was just corrected on the pronunciation. I've learned some. In Kalamazoo, yes. I have learned much in our pregame today. I shall learn even more during the game itself. So, welcome, Rabbi Schicker.
Thank you so much, Pastor.
And
it's my pleasure to be here.
Yes, and I think we've already cleared this up, but just for everybody else's good, we'll probably just refer to you as Rabbi for the remainder of the show, if that's okay with you.
That's absolutely fine.
Today, we are... Oh, what's the title of today's show, Pastor James?
Give it a rest, sort of.
Yes! Today is Give It a Rest!
But I'm going to give my plug. You could also call this one Nope, Not Today.
I got to write that down so I remember to actually post that, because they're both...
All right.
Give it a rest, nope, not today.
Maybe we should even ask our viewers to vote on what the title of the episode is.
Oh, because then we would see who actually cares enough to vote.
Yeah, and you get entered to win a free car that you then don't get.
When you say card, you mean like a birthday card, right?
All right.
Oh, no, I'm not giving them a car, Pastor James.
No. It's just to get the clicks.
Oh, you say free car, and then, in the fine print, it's, Hot Wheels.
Fine print, not actually. All right.
So when we say give it a rest, what do we mean, Pastor James? What are we talking about?
Well, for our viewers, it's probably on this bantering right now, but actually what we're talking about today on this Thursday is Sabbath, which is Saturday. Traditionally, Christians tried to come up with their own thing, but that's why we have our stalwart rabbi with us today to set us straight, set the record straight, clear the air. We're going to resolve this once and for all. Sabbath. Pastor Chris, where did you want to go with that, other than that's what we're talking about today?
So, first things first, right? This is my first opportunity to put my foot in my mouth. But I think the concept, at least for Jews and Christians, of Sabbath comes from the Ten Commandments, right? Am I right, Rabbi?
It comes from Genesis first.
Oh, yes, you are quite correct. On the seventh day, God rested. I told you to put my foot in my mouth.
You're not wrong about the Ten Commandments, right? You're not wrong. But we get the idea of Sabbath originally from creation, right? God rested on the seventh day.
Well, since you said it, then yes, I will share a different screen. Instead of the screen I was going to share, I shall share the other screen. Can you all see Genesis 1?
I'm not sure everyone can. I think it could be embiggened a little bit.
I will embiggen it then. But I'm going to do that by moving a Word document over. Can you see that Word document?
No.
No, we're just seeing logos.
You have to click something to be able to let us follow with you.
Yeah, I moved it onto the screen, but that wasn't sufficient.
No, you have to select it through Zoom separately. Because you're not sharing your screen, you're sharing the document specifically.
I am now moving this Word document over. Obviously, I was not as prepared as I thought I was.
Yeah.
I shall embiggen it. We are in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as I now share my screen correctly. Can you see Genesis 1 and Genesis 2?
There you go.
Yes,
yeah.
There you go.
Now let's see. Is it even bigger now?
Oh, man.
Yes, it's very nice and big.
Okay, good.
No one can complain.
So at the end of Genesis 1, and Rabbi, you may have a different division than I do. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." And God is talking to human beings, of course. God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was, if I remember correctly, tov me'ot, very good. And there was evening and there was morning of the sixth day. So this is the end of the sixth day of creation. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. These are the toholadot of the heavens and the earth when they were created.
Yep. So that's the first mention.
Well,
and to be fair, God kind of deserved a rest after creating the universe in 6 days. That's good handiwork.
heavy lifting there on those days, yes. And so one of the things I have actually heard said is, if God can rest, so can you.
I mean, that's a fair point. I think it's an important point. I think that we don't give one another and ourselves, honestly, the space and ability to truly rest. And that we forget how draining it is to not have a moment. To, as I tell my stepchildren, being bored is healthy for you. Psychologists agree with this, right? Like, we need that time for rest, reflection, as well as creativity, where you're not constantly worried about what the next thing is to do, right? That is where we become creative as human beings. So it's not only about resting from the work to be done, but also the wonderful things that can come out of that time, that we're not being specifically now bombarded by everything on our phones.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you should say that, Rabbi, because I read this at least once a year, probably multiple times a year. And what I just realized is, God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. There's no command there. It's simply a description of what's going on. And thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. When I was serving my first congregation, in my first call, I had preached about I think I had preached about light and darkness, and one of my farmers stopped me at the end of worship that night, because I think it was a midweek evening service for Advent, and he said, "You know, Pastor, even the earth needs rest." And obviously that's going to look different in the tropics than it does here in a more temperate climate. But the earth in Michigan gets about a 6 month rest, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, but
right.
Well,
But I mean, we can connect it to what we've seen with COVID and with the shutting down of a lot of plants and other things. Right, the earth is rejuvenating itself. And we know, I mean, throughout Torah, throughout the Bible, there's mentions of the Jubilee year, right? And you're supposed to let things lie fallow, and you're not supposed to plant the same crops in the same ground year after year after year. And people used to look at that and be like, oh, that's, superstitious. Like, it doesn't matter. But we know from farmers who've worked the land, it does matter. The earth itself needs time to rejuvenate. And we've seen it, I mean, if we look at the West Coast, we've seen it with fires, right? Natural fires that have run through burn off, things that need to be burnt off and protect the rest of the ecosystem. But but by cutting away all the brush that normally burns, right, we've influenced it in a different way. But yes, no, there's not a commandment there, but it is what is reflected back when we're given the commandments of Sabbath, of rest later on, in Exodus and Deuteronomy specifically, with the 2 iterations of the 10 Commandments.
And one thing that occurs to me is that the way it's written. Could you bring that back up for a second, please, Pastor Chris?
Sure. I can do that right now. It's going to be a little smaller, though.
Okay, that's fine. Hopefully my point will still stand when I go back to the text, and I won't be like, oh, I don't know what I was thinking there.
Can you see it?
Yeah. So I think there's a sense the way everything flows with each other. The seventh day is really an integral part of the process, the completion of creation. It's not. I think sometimes we would be tempted to read this because this is how we would think of work, that we do the job and then we rest. And I think really, and unfortunately, the chapter dividers in the 1400s or whatever stopped. That was their mindset, right? Because they stopped right after the 6th day, and then the 7th day is almost like a tangent. But really, it's kind of the culmination of everything. And or I'd even say maybe like a capstone, that you take that out and you don't have a biblical understanding of work or of creation.
Well said, Pastor James. Shall we fast forward a book or two to the 10 Commandments? But fair warning, and I have copied this out of the Lutheran Study Bible, published by Augsburg Fortress. So you can correct my source if it's incorrect, but I'm pretty sure I copied it correctly. These are the 10 Commandments. Is this a correct breakdown of the Jewish 10 Commandments? And man, do I hope so, because I've been teaching it for like 3 or 4 years now.
I almost hope it's not, just so we break some news on this.
Yes. Yeah, you have it correct.
Okay.
So for our Jewish siblings then, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy is the 4th commandment, right?
Correct.
Because for Lutherans, it's the 3rd commandment. And for non-Lutherans, although non-Lutheran Protestants is what I mean, that goes back to the 4th commandment, though for other reasons.
Yeah. Which again, it's the Decalogue, 10 words, and it doesn't really say anywhere.
Right, it's the 10. It's the 10 things. It's not numbered in the text, right? We number them separately. It's like the surprise I get from kids when I'm like, no, there's not just 10 commandments. And they're like, but there's 10 commandments. I'm like, well, there's 613 commandments by our count and our tradition, but there are 10 very important ones.
Already hard enough.
Yeah. But it's the same thing with the plagues. Like, you try to get people to name off all 10 plagues or commandments, and people always manage to miss one, and it's never the same one.
Yeah. And then
plagues get translated in different ways too. Like, different words are used depending, and so people are like, "Oh, but I count 10." I'm like, those two things are technically the same one.
I'm not even sure I could get them in order. The plagues, I can get the commandments, but not the plagues.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's not as easy as people want to make it out to be.
I would not claim it was easy.
I think we need to go on the record though, Pastor Chris. Whatever order they were in, by the end, would you have let them go? I vote yes.
All right.
Yes. Thank you for keeping us moving along there, Rabbi. So
anyway, so they are let go. And they go to Mount Sinai after a little intrigue, to put it lightly. A
little intrigue, yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. There's a cosmic battle between the Lord and Pharaoh, and or pardon me, on this night I declare war against all the gods of Egypt, right? So it's not really necessarily just against Pharaoh. God wins. God's the hero of the story, so God wins. And then they go to the mountain, and God gives them the commandments. Tell us, Rabbi, what is your understanding of? Sorry, I got to bring it back up. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And what is Sabbath?
Right. So as a piece of that, a notation that, one Exodus is remember, and Deuteronomy is observe, right? Shamor and Zachor are the Hebrew words, and it is the basis of the reason that we light 2 candles at the beginning of the Sabbath, as recognition of both of these notations of how we're supposed to observe or remember the Sabbath. Traditionally speaking, Sabbath begins right before sunset on Friday and ends when there's 3 stars in the sky on Saturday, which is approximately 25 hours. And there's lots and lots of prohibitions as to what you are supposed to and not supposed to do on Sabbath, which all arise from a handful of verses stating specifically, like, you don't do X on the Sabbath. It is a day of rest. You're not supposed to do work. But then the sages of the mission of the Talmud, of our commentaries, take those and say, well, how does that apply today? And we're talking about between the years 200 and 700 that they're making these distinctions. And they declare that there's 39 divisions of forbidden labor. And amongst those 39 divisions are a lot of things that people like to do. But it all arises out of, you're not supposed to plow your field. You're not supposed to plant new things. You're not supposed to light fire. You're not supposed, and it's not just you yourself, but also your wife, your children, your manservant, your maidservant, your slaves, your animals, right? Even the animals themselves are not supposed to be used for any type of work or labor.
If I remember the text, and the resident alien who resides among you, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And there is resident alien, the non-citizen as well. It's not just about, which, is an interesting commentary also on the structure of society, right? It's not just about the person who's in charge. It's also about everyone, including animals who are being used for work. This obviously leads then, as we move to modern times and inclusion of modern times, an evolution of what these forbidden things mean, right? It's pretty easy to say, well, I'm not going to go outside and plant my garden today. Like, that is explicitly said that I'm not supposed to do that. But where does the electricity piece, which is everyone's favorite thing to talk about with me, come into play, right? Like, why don't observant Jews turn their lights on and off during the Sabbath on Shabbat for the Hebrew? And it arises from this idea that if you're not supposed to have fire, which was light for our ancestors, and depending on what type of, form of electricity you're talking about, you're not supposed to be creating something new. That's another aspect. And that goes all the way back to Genesis, right? God ceased from creation. Therefore, on Shabbat, you're not supposed to create anything new, which is where the prohibition against writing comes from. Tearing, sewing, like with a thread, not just sewing in the ground. All of, art, woodworking, right? You're not supposed to be creating anything permanent. And then from that, we get this idea from Pirkei Avot, from the ethics of the fathers, that is there's also a fence put around that law, right? So not only like this, there's the law you don't want to break, and then there's things that could lead to breaking that law, even if it's by accident, that you also forbid in order to protect people. The idea is protecting people.
Yeah.
It's also sometimes in order to not let people think that you're doing something wrong when you're not.
Can I jump in for a second with something that may be wrong? So free to shoot it down. But I feel like you can see an example of that even in the Ten Commandments itself, where it's do not steal, but then goes on to coveting. And I think part of the idea is coveting, that desire often leads to something worse down the road.
Absolutely. I mean, we see, 613 commandments. There are some repetitions in there, or some things, that work together in order to occur. But I mean, there's just a lot of things that are forbidden. So if you move to today, Pastor Chris knows lots about this. If you move to today, there's lots of ways that people have figured out to get around the letter of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you think of people who live in really tall high rises, whether you're talking in New York or you're talking in Israel or somewhere else, you live on the 30th floor, you're not going to go up and down those stairs in and out of your house. Like that's a lot. Like that's a lot of work, actually. So how do you get around it? Because you're not supposed to click the buttons on the elevator. Well, instead they have one elevator that's set to stop at every single floor, to open and to close. And it does it automatically, and it does it for the 25 hours. So you're not doing anything. You're just existing in the space. Everywhere from things like that to, before we had so much technology that we could tell things to turn on and off automatically, which is allowed if it's all set up before the Sabbath starts, and why people love crock pots and things of that nature that keep food warm. There was this idea of the non-Jew, the Shabbos Goy with the Yiddish, who was, someone you'd hire before to like come in and do things like light the fire or turn off the stove or things of that nature. That being said, it's a very iffy area, right, in the law, because you're not supposed to specifically ask anything of someone that would cause them to do something against the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Right. So it's more along the lines of like, from my understanding, I mean, people don't do this anymore, right? Like this is a couple generations ago, but more along the lines of, wouldn't it be nice if the fire was on? Right? Like just to the air as if nothing, right? So
does Alexa ever get a day of rest or not?
So Alexa it would, you're deliberately using something. That's not allowed. Like,
okay, but not for her own sake, because it's you doing. So she's like one of the animals that gets a day off, though. It's because you're telling her to do something that she gets the day off.
Correct. That is, you're causing it to happen. That's not supposed to be allowed.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
There's all of these. So there's a lot of things you're not supposed to do. You're not supposed to carry things outside of your house, which gets really complicated. Which is the one thing I wanted to bring up was the idea of the A-roof, which is the idea of enclosing public space to make it private space. It's generally a piece of wire that's been strung around a certain area. There's lots of restrictions about how big the area can be and how many people are passing through at any given time. But it's why a lot of observant Jews who walk, because you're not supposed to drive, right, combustion engines, to synagogue on the Sabbath, live within a certain radius. It also means that they can push their baby carriages or carry their car, their house keys or something of that nature, if you're within these spaces.
But do I remember correctly, Rabbi, that if you were walking to synagogue on Sabbath, and you saw somebody, today it would be in a car accident, you are allowed to help them on the Sabbath, right? That's a specific exclusion of mercy, right?
It's a specific exclusion of life taking priority.
That's what it is.
It's life taking priority. If someone is drowning, you are obligated to save them. If you can, there's, save them or get help. Save them or get help. If you don't know how to swim, don't jump in after the drowning person, obviously. But yes, car accident, anything else, you are obligated to do something to save life. That includes picking up the phone and calling the ambulance, right? Or whatever it is that needs to occur. There are exclusions. The highest exclusion is life, right? That's the one that trumps basically anything else.
Makes sense.
And of course, that's the one Jesus drives a Mack truck through in the Gospels, right? That not only do you rescue someone in immediate danger right now, but when he heals the woman who's been
crippled for 18 years.
What was her malady? I forget.
Well, there was the one woman who was bent over, and then there was the one woman.
That's the one I'm going with. She's bent over for 18 years, and I it's really interesting, Rabbi, because you were talking about there's an obligation to help out if you can, and in that passage he specifically uses the Greek word "dei," which is necessary. Was it not necessary that I release her from her bondage? Or so I almost wonder if Jesus / the writer is kind of intentionally playing with that language in that case.
Possibly. I won't speak to, that's not my area of expertise, so I won't speak to that particular thing. But I think absolutely, I mean, I think we have to think of the context in which things are occurring, right? The context in which Jesus is living and teaching. And
at least 200 years before those rabbis you were just talking about, you said, between 200 and 700.
Is when it's codified.
Codified, right. Well, Jesus...
Okay.
Yeah. Jesus is still in a time period when they're still debating some of the finer points.
Yeah.
This is a sincere question, Rabbi. If you live in a place where for some of the year the sun doesn't set, if you're north of the Arctic Circle or south of the Antarctic Circle.
Not my area of expertise. There's a lot written on it.
Is there? Okay.
I had a classmate who wrote his thesis on what Jewish life would look like when we colonize Mars.
Oh, interesting.
In a very legitimate, like asking all of these questions, right? Uh-huh. If the day is different, are we based on the day on Earth or are we based on the day elsewhere?
Oh, interesting.
When Ilan Ramon was on the International Space Station, before dying in the crash, when he as an Israeli, even though he was not a particularly observant Jew, thought it was very important to observe the Sabbath while on the International Space Station, as kind of like a representative thing. And he picked the time zone because he's like, well, we're moving much faster, right? So he picked the time zone and observed Shabbat for 25 hours based on that time zone.
Well, you'd have to do something because you see the sun rise and set, 25 times a day, something like that, right?
So but it's a big question. It's a big question. It's just not something that I've done a lot of reading on particularly.
Now I'm curious to know if there's because I read a lot of science fiction. I'm curious to know if there's Jewish science fiction about how they've answered that question extraterrestrially.
I would say definitely, but also I would have to ask people what their recommendations are.
Conversation for another time. Wow, we've covered quite a few of the questions. When does Sabbath start? Oh, is it true, Rabbi? Actually, you might have taught me this, to be honest with you, now that I think about it. There was evening and there was morning the first day. There was evening and there was morning the seventh day. That's the refrain.
Yes.
Is that why Sabbath starts at night?
It's why all Jewish days start at sunset. So if you're trying to translate a secular Gregorian date to a Jewish date, the software now that will do it for you asks if it's before or after sunset because it makes a difference.
Oh.
That's where the transition is. It's why all Jewish holidays start in the evening, which really throws everyone off when they look at a calendar and they're like, it's not a Jewish holiday. I'm like, no, at sunset it's a Jewish holiday.
It depends on your calendar. Where I'm from, the calendars say starts at sunset.
Well, see, that's nice.
As I mentioned, there's a much higher percentage of Jews there. So
but it's a big piece. But it arises directly out of Genesis 1.
I was also in my world religions class in college. I was taught that the holiest day on the Jewish calendar is Shabbat. You and I have had that conversation in another context, but if you would respond to that, Rabbi.
Sure. It's a holiday every week. It's a holy day. So there's kadosh, which is the root for holy, and there's hol, which is the root. It's not unholy, which often gets translated as unholy. It's normal or regular, right? Like the normal, regular, average thing versus the holy thing. It's not a negative to be normal, right? The rest of the week isn't a bad thing. Shabbat's just like the better thing, the holy thing. as are the holidays. So there's that distinction is we're supposed to treat Shabbat as different and special and set aside. The ceremony we do at the end of Shabbat on Saturday night is called Havdalah, which means separation. And it's to separate that holy moment from the regular moment and to bless the week as it begins. So it's a beautiful recognition of this cycle, right? Of we go through and we rest, and we go through and we rest, and working 7 days a week it's not healthy for anyone.
Can I get into that?
Even if many of us do it, it's not great for us.
Right. That was actually one of my questions back when we were first talking about doing this show is, as a pastor, I've often encouraged Sabbath because it's how we read the Ten Commandments too. You don't get out of it just because because Jesus has different teaching on it, or because the church went in one direction on it. But it's my question is increasingly becoming: is it really possible to keep it when the culture is so 7 days a week? Because I think the problem is when it's made a personal thing instead of a social thing, where all of society is doing it. It puts people under a lot of extreme pressure to maybe lose a job. I'm sure, Rabbi, that you and your congregation deal with these type of challenges too. And so I hear all this personalization of taking Sabbath time, but I wonder if it really works apart from having a community that kind of safeguards each other and says, no, this is a set time that we are going to take off. Of course, in Judaism, it's traditionally been Saturday. Here, even in the U.S., they had kind of blue laws on Sunday, which I could gripe about. That's another subject. But there was still that communal sense that not as much things are happening that day. So I'd love, Rabbi, if you could respond, and then Pastor Chris as well, just to kind of flesh that question out.
Sure, it's a great question. I mean, I think that's where reform movements of all kinds, right, changes to our, I'm a Reformed Jew, so I'm using in that context, but also right. Liberal movements of Christianity, right, different understandings of what one's expectations are. It's very hard. It was very hard for Jews when they, at various points came to what became the United States or was the United States, the expectation that they work on Saturdays. Some people had some very creative workarounds. I mean, some people just worked on Saturday, and it's the reason, at least for liberal Jewry, that Friday nights became much more heavily attended than Saturday morning services, was because people could attend Friday nights and still work.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
so that's a piece of it. There was a movement at a certain point to move Shabbat to Sunday, and it was successful in a handful of communities. Most places really disliked it, and it didn't hold, but it held in some communities for a while, that they just had services. I mean, technically, if you're talking about it, like, Jews have services 7 days a week. Like, we're supposed to pray 7 days a week. It's just not the Sabbath. So there's that piece. But there were also people who would, like, sell their business every Friday to, like, one of their non-Jewish workers, who would, like, be the owner on Saturday and have the store open, and then they'd buy it back.
That's awesome.
Workarounds, right? Because if you're not supposed to work, you're not supposed to have other people work either. So if you're the owner of the store, that's complicated if it's open on Saturday. That being said, I think there's always the piece that is often overlooked, that Judaism sees certain laws as God's laws and certain laws as, like, enforceable by other people, right? And who gives forgiveness? Like, if you hurt another person, you have to deal with that other person. God's not responsible for forgiving you, right? Breaking the Sabbath, that's really God's law. So there are aspects of certain communities who've kind of been like, you're not supposed to do that. I'm not going to participate in it, but it's not really my place to, like, I'm not going to kick you out of the community because you sin.
Right.
Because ultimately it's not my, that's not my role. There was some of that as well. Today, I tend to tell my congregants that it's important, but what Sabbath looks like is different for different people. If I told my partner, whose favorite thing to do is to build things, that he's not allowed to build things on the Sabbath, then we wouldn't be together anymore. Because we've had this conversation, and I feel comfortable sharing this because I've said it in a number of sermons too. Poor guy, he always gets used as the example. But so does my mother, who doesn't do laundry on Shabbat. Like, that's her thing. She will do all kinds of other things. She will spend money. She does not do laundry because that is the chore she does not like to do.
Yeah.
And therefore, her way to rest is she attends services and she doesn't do laundry. The evolution of how liberal progressive Judaism has interacted with the United States, and Sunday being the day of rest for many people, has evolved over time. It's also evolved because as people moved into the suburbs, people had to have a conversation about, like, well, if I can't walk to the synagogue, what am I like? I physically can't do that. So the conservative movement comes out with a ruling that, like, you're allowed to drive to and from the synagogue, but nowhere else, right? Like, you're not supposed to go other places, but you drive to and from the synagogue because you're supposed to be at synagogue. And since you physically can't get there, that's an exception. But it's hard. Talk about like kids' sports.
Yeah.
Kids after activity, everything happens on Saturday. Everything happens on Saturday. But it's also dependent on the community that you belong to. If everyone you're surrounded with, even if you're on the liberal side, Reform, conservative, or etc., if everyone you're surrounded with all the time, or you live in a predominantly Jewish area and there's this different understanding of the way the week works, then it's not as difficult as, I grew up in Houston on the not Jewish side of the city. I have to clarify that because the one side, they had like all the holidays off at the public schools because there were so many Jews. But majority Christians, we had Hebrew school on Wednesday nights because that's when all the churches were doing Bible study. Therefore, the public schools did not have any activities occurring. Like, that was the order of operations, right? Our choice was based on everyone else's choices and needs, which worked out fine. But it also was complicated when, like, Yom Kippur, our holiest day, was, landed on a football night, and the kids got into trouble. Most of my friends weren't football players. They were in the band, but would get into trouble if they skipped the game because they were supposed to be there, even though it's like, no, this is a really important holiday. You shouldn't be making people, you shouldn't be penalizing someone for
the
not.
free exercise clause of the First Amendment just went bam.
Yeah, that's in my other job. Not now, and now I'm an instructor, but in my other job, a lot of what I do is, they say they worship this. Is that true, chaplain? And unfortunate amount of the time, I have to say, let me look that up. But when you have an active Jewish worshiping community, right? I would actually, and you try to get out in front of things, right? And you try to say, Yom Kippur is coming up. Your Jewish soldiers might want to attend this service. Battalion commander has said your Jewish soldiers can attend this service. You're going to make this happen if they want to, Right. It's the advantage to hierarchy too, but we take that First Amendment, we take those two religious clauses very seriously in my other job. P.S. My opinions are not my own. My opinions are my own and do not reflect those of the United States Army or any other department, branch, or bureau of the federal government.
He's lying.
It's interesting, though, that you should ask that question, Pastor James, because as I think about it, and I'm sorry, this just occurred to me. I'm an external processor. There's a lot of stuff that is easier to observe in community, like kosher. I've been inside supermarkets that are basically turn left for kosher and turn right for goy. Right? Now I should tell you that, there are, the women all wear long skirts and long sleeves in some of those communities. But and one of the neighboring school districts where I grew up, they all had off on the Jewish holidays. Cherry Hill. I don't know what things are like there now. I'm talking about 20 years ago, but and it's interesting. Like, I don't know. There's just so much. Did you guys ever read Laura Ingalls Wilder when you were growing up?
My favorite. I went to her house in Missouri.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
I'll let you have any questions about that.
I remember she describes Sabbath day. I think it's Little House on the Prairie, but it might be Little House in the Big Woods. She describes their Sabbath. They don't hitch the horses. They don't cook their food. They cold leftovers from the day before. They walk to church with their Bibles in their hands, and it was a distance because they were in the middle of nowhere. I mean, they took off and they took off. But, when I went to Sunday school and we talked about that, like you were talking, building things is your partner's favorite thing to do. My Sunday school teacher really liked to garden, and that's how she relaxed. I think of gardening and I cringe, but because there's dirt and bugs and heat out there. But also, I mean, I was raised by a nurse, right? And she works every other Sunday because the hospital doesn't shut down on weekends.
Right.
So yes, you are I think you're right, Pastor James, that these things are easier in community. And then I think about, the three of us, all of whom work on our Sabbath days.
The messengers are the worst people to talk about it in this case. But.
Oh my goodness. Can I tell you how many times the church and or the army has been like, make sure you take a day off. And they were telling me this on my day off.
Right.
What was supposed to be my day off before you called me in here and made me be here.
Yeah. And my fear is just, I think, Sabbath, when you can find it, how you can find it during the week is, I think, the way things are probably going to be for a very long time. But my fear is just, I think the concept of Sabbath, I totally agree, Rabbi, when you were talking about we can't just be 24/7 on all the time. So I think it's a very useful idea, and I worry that I don't think people really are taking the time to just be bored. And in many cases, especially, with wages not having increased a great deal for people while hours do, and the gig economy literally can't. I've always grown up at kind of a bourgeois level, I'll be honest, where I can find Sabbath if I make a point of it, and that is just not the case for everyone. And again, that's why I don't know what can be done about it, but I do kind of lament the loss of communal feel, and I hear you saying Jews in many parts of the country have been dealing with that for a long time. but for Christians, I think kind of losing Sunday is a relatively new thing.
It's complicated. I mean, I grew up in an interfaith household. My father's Catholic, my mother's Jewish, and my mother's, a U.S. citizen now, but didn't come over until her mid-20s from South Africa. And one of the things that she was horrified by is, national holidays, that things are still open. So Thanksgiving, my mother, there was no way anyone was leaving our house to go to a store on Thanksgiving. It doesn't matter if you need that thing that you were supposed to cook, deal. As far as she was concerned, and Christmas the same way, actually. People should be home with their families. People are allowed to have a day off, and the stores can deal for 24 hours. Yeah. And I hold to those values very strongly, because I agree. It's absurd to think that everyone can go all of the time. For my mother's birthday last month, I sent her a book that I hadn't read yet, but on technology Sabbath. This woman's written about taking a technology Sabbath, not using the phones and not using the computer, for the day. Her and her family, they've been doing it for years. It was hard at the beginning. Now it's something that they look forward to.
I bet.
And that they find it, like they do all kinds of other things, and they might go and spend money, and they might, she's Jewish, the specific writer, but there's been a few from Christian perspectives written too in the same vein, that just to take a moment, and I'll say I was, as we all were, right, on since the middle of March, like nonstop, forget days off. I was like, I finally took a week of vacation in July, and I just didn't read the news and mostly left my phone alone for a whole week. And it was the most relaxing experience because I was not checking my email a bazillion times a day or worried that the world was going to end, checking the news first thing in the morning, which is really a bad habit, which I know, but still do, as we all do bad habits. But just like even a couple of hours, right? Like even a couple of hours of just like not being concerned about what's next, I think does a world of good for our mental and physical well-beings. But it's hard. You're 100% right, Pastor James, in regards to, between the gig economy and wages not raised, right? We don't all have the freedom to take time.
Recognizing that I will simply leave politics out of it. And Ben Sass, who is I think he's the junior senator from Nebraska, he talks about how he and his family take a technology Sabbath every Sunday. They just leave off their devices. And that's got to be especially hard when you have teenagers in the house.
Well, and if you're a U.S. senator with how fast stuff moves, earlier we said if God can take a day off, you can too. Maybe if you're a U.S. senator can take a day off technology, you can too.
I mean, not to make it about politics at all, but when Lieberman was on the ticket, vice president, I mean, there was a lot of conversations because he is an observant Jew, and his aides knew where to find him, right? Like if there was a true emergency, they knew he was at synagogue.
Right.
on like that, they knew he was there, and if there was a true emergency, right, like they could find him, but they had to go and track him down because he observed his faith, and people were I remember I was young, but I remember the conversations that were like occurring in the public consciousness about well, what if there's like a nuclear attack, and people are like that's no.
Well, and how does that not apply to when our Catholic president was in mass? Like there could be a nuclear attack on Sunday morning. Come on.
Yes. So but that's the point, right? Those conversations have to occur though, because as Lieberman I think said pretty publicly, like they know where I haven't disappeared. I am findable. But had to go a ways back for that reference. But I think it's relevant to the fact that there are ways. It's not easy, it's not simple. But maybe that's what makes it sweeter when you get that time. Like when people go camping and don't take technology with them. Like
I was just thinking of right before you brought up camping that I love going to state and national parks, and my best definition of a good hike is when I get far enough into the woods that I can no longer hear the traffic on the road.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry, I don't mind being in the woods as long as I keep moving, because the bugs, they like me a lot. But I really need my air conditioning and my nice soft bed.
You need to eat more garlic.
Oh, will that turn them away?
It'll turn anyone away.
No, really. Well, your blood's too sweet. Like actually, the bugs can smell. So garlic is a turnoff. It also keeps vampires away, so you get that benefit.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And getting back to Sabbath then. So I have a sincere question then, Rabbi, and what you said about selling the business and then buying it back made me think of this. So these years are going to be pretty close. In 1946, 1947, and 1948, my beloved grandmother, Graham, worked. Long story, they were poor. Not poor like most people conceive of poor today, but like 8 cracked eggs poor. Or let me rephrase, not poor like my parents talk about being poor, but much poorer than that. She worked for a Jewish family 3 summers in a row down the Jersey Shore, and she honestly couldn't remember about their synagogue going habits, but they made sure she went to mass on Sunday. And I asked her, "Oh, they let you go?" She was like, "No, you don't understand. They made sure I went to mass on Sunday." I assume that they worked this out with my great grandmother. I don't know that this had all been sort of prearranged by the adults. But when you talk about, as I think of the law and the resident alien that lives among you, and then I think about observant Jews and Sabbath, could there be a provision for we'll observe our Sabbath and we'll make sure you observe yours?
I think that's the way it's worked in reality. You also have to realize that a lot of the commandments, a lot of those rules and regulations are, given with the understanding that you're within the biblical land, right?
Right.
Where this is the law.
Right.
We have, there's lots of commentary and lots of laws, like we're supposed to follow the law of the land, right? That is the law. Obviously not if it's going against something like killing someone, but you get the general idea.
Yeah.
The law of the land holds and stands, and we work, within it. So yes, I'm sure that there was, back and forth with people of like, if I can have this day off, then I will work that day. There are a lot of Jewish Santa Clauses at Christmas time. There's a lot of Jews who specifically will, work out with their, particular Christian colleagues. Like, I'll cover the Christmas shift, right? I'll cover the Easter shift. This day doesn't mean anything to me. It's any other day of the year. Therefore, like, how can I be helpful?
Well, you go get Jewish. Where I'm from, you go get Chinese food on Christmas.
Well, yes, because they're open. That's where it comes from. The idea of like American Jews and Chinese food comes from that was what was open. So like, why wouldn't you go in and get Chinese food? So there's that piece as well, right? It's working within the community setting. We know from historical documents, pre-Civil War in this country, that the Jewish community that existed, particularly in the South, was very close to their Christian neighbors. There was just kind of this understanding, like, you go worship on this day and I go worship on that day, but other than that, like, we're pretty much alike.
Wait, where is this?
We're talking South Carolina, Georgia. Yeah.
Aren't those the same states where Jews couldn't join the country clubs?
Yes, but that's post-Civil War.
Oh! Thank you for the clarification.
There's a huge shift in an understanding of acceptance pre and post Civil War.
Fascinating.
They totally, right? Pre-Civil War, Jews are not slaves, right? They're not black, they're not from Africa. Therefore, they're your neighbors. Post-Civil War, we have a restructuring of our understanding of, what we now deem race, eugenics, etc. Also a massive immigration from Eastern Europe, which is a whole other topic. Yeah. Economics then come into play, language comes into play, etc. But pre-Civil War, it's a very different reality for Jews in the United States.
Well, and even as you say that, I seem to recall George Washington wrote a letter to a synagogue.
Rhode Island.
But George Washington was a Virginian.
So his letter is a response. So after the establishment of the United States, the Jewish community was a little concerned that they'd start being taxed differently or wouldn't be able to allow to practice their faith in the same way that they had been. And the community from Providence writes to George Washington. You can Google the letter. Both sides, the letter from them and to them. We have copies of both. And they're like, well, just like testing the waters, and he responds very favorably and says, nothing's going to change. But it's a great letter.
Yeah, and as I recall, there's an argument about who the letter belongs to now, because the original synagogue closed and reopened. I'm not remembering all the details, but I read an article about it.
There's also lots of, if anyone ever wants to really dig a rabbit hole on the internet, try and figure out what synagogue is truly the oldest one in North America.
Oh, sorry.
Because 4 or 5 all claim it for different reasons.
Okay. And I would just like to name and claim this, James. When Luther in his large catechism writes about what we call the third commandment, I think he is unfairly hard on the Jews in particular, and in their interpretation of the third commandment. And I think in his interpretation, I think he rightly, what was the word you used, Pastor James? You talked about how he rightly spiritualizes it.
I don't remember saying that, but I mean, he does, I think.
Well, in any case, Luther goes on to say, this isn't really about physical rest.
But it's almost a symbol for kind of what he does with the entire Jewish covenant too, honestly. It's what he and many other Christians have done in terms of taking things that are legal or ceremonial and then saying, well, here's the spiritual meaning behind what God is actually trying to say here.
So yeah, Luther says, and he's pretty point blank about it. He says, this commandment is about hearing God's word. This right. is about basically about going to worship. And while I can agree with that, he goes on to say that it's not about physical rest. Yes, it is. and his elitism comes out, right? Well, all the manservants and the maidservants and the people who do physical labor, I'm paraphrasing, who do physical labor, they need the day of rest. But us elite, intellectual, non-hard-working people, we don't need the day. Yes, you do. I just wanted to, get that out there. And there are only 2 places in the Catechism where I actually disagree with Luther, and that's one of them. Yeah,
and I mostly agree with you, but playing devil's advocate, I wonder, Rabbi, you were talking about earlier, there's like which laws apply, when you're in the land of Israel or whatever, and maybe there's some of that going on with Luther too, is this Sabbath was for a specific context, specific people, and I would argue we haven't talked enough, and maybe it's because 2 or 3 of us are Christians, but about Sabbath as a marker of the Jewish people, and I think there's something legitimate about that. Like maybe he's misinterpreting it, but he's also saying, well, this is very cultural and really ethnically tied to a large extent. I don't know. Does anyone agree with that? Or
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm actually going to read from the text. In the Old Testament, God set apart the 7th day, appointed it for rest, and commanded it to be kept holy above all other days. As far as outward observance is concerned, this commandment was given to the Jews alone. They were to refrain from hard work and to rest so that both human beings and animals might be refreshed and not be exhausted by constant labor. In time, however, and I'm just going to read what he wrote here, Rabbi. In time, however, the Jews interpreted this commandment too narrowly and grossly misused it. They slandered Christ and would not permit him to do the very same things they themselves did on that day, as we read in the Gospel, as if the commandment could be fulfilled by refraining from work of any kind. This was not its intention, but rather, as we shall hear, it meant that we should sanctify the holy day or day of rest. Therefore, according to its outward meaning, this commandment does not concern us Christians. It is entirely an external matter, like the other regulations of the Old Testament associated with particular customs, persons, times, and places, from which all of us are now set free through Christ. But to give a Christian interpretation to the simple people, elitism, to give an Christian interpretation to the simple people of what God requires us in this commandment. Note that we do not observe holy days for the sake of intelligent and well-informed Christians, for they have no need of them. We observe them first because our bodies need them. Nature teaches and demands that the common people, men servants and maid servants, who have gone about their work or trade all week long, should also retire for a day to rest and be refreshed. Second, and most important, we observe them so that people will have time and opportunity on such days of rest, which otherwise would not be available, to attend worship services, that is, so that they may assemble to hear and discuss God's word, and then to offer praise, song, and prayer to God. He goes on, I mean, it's the large catechism, so it goes on at length, but I think
it's
unfair.
Very interesting. I mean, look, what I read of Luther mostly, and directly impacts on how much his feelings shifted from I'm going to convert the Jews to the Jews are horrible because they won't let me convert them, is mostly where my deep understanding of Luther is arises from. But I think it's interesting to say one of the 10 commandments, which Christians have held up, hold up as this is the foundation of God's law, to push it aside in such a way, because then I was like, well, what about the other ones? How does he feel about stealing? Is as a non-Lutheran, right? That's what, my first question is okay, but what about God and not stealing and not coveting, and if not observing the Sabbath, okay, but what about everything? What about the others that are then held up?
And to be
fair, he
actually
gets into that, which is he says that all the other 9, in his opinion, and you do not have to agree with this, but it can be proven by natural law. And actually, that's what he does with much of the Jewish law, is he says that this or the Old Testament law, this is the law for a specific time and a specific people. These ones apply to everyone, like do not steal, because we can reason out that,
he wouldn't have liked the early 20th century when we gave people weekends and didn't allow child labor.
He would have been opposed to child labor laws. He probably would have liked weekends.
I know that we can't put words into Luther's mouth. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just, a lot of the trade unionists and such in the United States, and the people who fought for weekends, a lot of that leadership were Jews who did so because of this idea of the importance of a Sabbath and the importance of rest, even though they themselves were often not observant in a traditional sense. It was from that basis. So I find it very interesting. Thank you for sharing those words, Pastor Chris.
Yeah, he goes on at some length, right?
Well, of course.
But he does say that one day should be set aside for the common people.
Well, and again, I think, Pastor Chris, you're kind of in the worst possible light on this, which is the common people worked a heck of a lot harder than people like Luther did back in that day. So,
and the common people were most people, right? I mean, he's talking about a very small percent of educated, wealthy, landed people to whom he would say he would try to defend the common folk, the men servants, the manservants, the manservants, the maid servants, the tradesmen, the et cetera, yeah.
So I think when you read it with scare quotes or whatever, it sounds elitist, but really, I think he's just saying, look, if you're a coal miner, you're breaking your back 16 or more hours a day in that time, whereas Prince Frederick or whatever, get out there at 10 a.m., a couple disputes, write a couple letters, and then entertain guests at 5 o'clock. It's like, I still think that person would need rest at some point, but I think you can make a much better argument that person already gets periods of rest within their day, unlike the day laborers that I think he's referring to as common people.
Which is most of his society, right?
Right.
Oh, absolutely. It's most of his society.
Yeah. So thank you for being willing to go there, both of you, for being willing to go there. I would say that among Christians, Sabbath is either ignored or it becomes an excuse to laziness. There seems to be no middle ground. So I need to take Sabbath now means I'm going to stop working because I'm tired. And it means I will only work 9 a to 5 p Monday through Friday, which I think is beyond the scope of the law, right? I mean, and I'm not excluding all kinds of work. I'm not including or excluding all kinds of work, right? And I think for the most part, we just completely ignore Sabbath. Just workaholics. A society that praises workaholism.
Well, we are that, for sure. And technology has only made it worse because our accessibility is so much more, right? When you were able to leave the office and then you had left the office, that was a very, very different world than we have in our 21st century reality.
Well, and in Laura Ingalls Wilder's, and I'm sure I'm screwing her name up, in the Little House on the Big Prairie world, right, you worked from sun up to sundown trying to stay alive.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So they needed a day of rest because otherwise they were going to die working.
Though I'm reading this book currently together, and I can't give you the subtitle because it's long, by the former Surgeon General. It's on loneliness as a health epidemic in our society. It's fascinating, actually. He traveled all over the world and interviewed all kinds of interesting people for this book. And part of it is talking with, people who've done, research on our ancestors way, way back. And they said that likely their day was divided into three: a third work, a third sleep, and a third social. Raising children, like the participation of raising children, eating, being with other people. And that we've evolved as a species, to need this social piece, which is why loneliness, as we define it, impacts health, which is just fascinating that I think, and we have to remember that so much work was also social for our ancestors. Right. If you were out in the field, you were often out in the field with other people. If you were, grinding, grain, to make flour, this was all done with other people. We weren't these silos that we are behind our, as he phrases it in the book, like behind our big fences, right, and our tall walls. Things were done together and early on because, like, you're safer in a group against, outsiders, predators, whatever. So, it's got a different twist to that.
Was there any?
I'm still struggling between because you play it off as an excuse for laziness, right? That's the part that struck me. And is it that, or is Sabbath really about a time to stop working?
I suppose it depends. If you've had 3 days off and you still need Sabbath, then yeah, it's an excuse for laziness. But if you haven't, I mean, I spent a whole year basically not having a day off. I needed to take a whole month off when I was done. I wish I'd had more Sabbath, frankly. But I have seen Sabbath wielded like a weapon against other people. I'm not going to do that. It's my Sabbath. Even not quite to the point, Rabbi, with what was your highest exclusion was the preservation of life, the defense of life. Yeah.
I mean, in today's society, one of the things that you can use as that example, like a doctor who's on call, right? Like I have a number of doctors in my congregation. They'll come to services. They'll tell me I'm I'm wearing my pager. If I leave in the middle, it's not you. I like that I like when they tell me that, because then I know that they haven't left because I've said something bad in my sermon. I'll be honest. But also, even in the high holidays, right? Like sometimes people are on call and they'll tell me, like, I'm here, but I might have to run.
Yeah.
So, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think for the most part, people ignore Sabbath and work too hard. But I have also seen Sabbath sort of wielded as a shield against, I don't want to work. It seems inappropriate, Pastor James, to call individuals specifically to task in this podcast, but, and it's no one on the screen. Please don't misunderstand me.
Look, I think anything can be wielded in the negative.
That's right.
I tell people all the time, because people are like, well, what is the Jewish perspective on X? And I'm like, well,
you
want A or you want B? Like, what are you looking for? Because you can make the argument. I say this for I think religion, like, we can do it. You can find a verse to defend whatever it is that you're saying. I mean, really, outside of like, I'm going to murder this person, right? But even then, right, there's plenty of verses of like, well, if someone does X, you should stone them to death.
Right.
So even there, it's rocky territory, and I think that's why I'm always telling my congregants, like, we read the text with the commentary next to it. Like, we don't read it in isolation, because that's not the way it's been for thousands of years, right? Our ancestors were not reading this in isolation, and we don't read it in isolation either. There's been evolution, there's been commentary, there's been interpretation. Anything that Jews do today is rabbinic Judaism. We're not the Israelites. Like, we don't sacrifice animals in our synagogue or temples. So apparently some people think we still do.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh, Rabbi. It sounds ridiculous, but I'm sure there are people who really think that.
Well, but I mean, isn't there a divide where some Jews, and not in your congregation at all, to be clear, would love the idea of being able to go back to the temple and start sacrificing animals?
Yes, there is.
I just think it's not laugh-worthy, you know?
There is a contingent who pray for the restoration of the temple, the building of the third temple in Jerusalem, you know, where the other two were, and would like to go back to animal sacrifice. They're a very slim proportion of world Jewry. Very slim proportion. That's not that people don't want a third temple, because alongside a third temple, you know, is utopia, right? The Messiah and all these other things. Like, lots more people want those things, but most people are pretty adamant that animal sacrifice is not what they're interested in, and that they appreciate that the rabbis, you know, substituted, you know, animal sacrifice for personal prayer. That was like a good evolution in most people's understandings. And I will say most, because you can't say all. That's not appropriate. But we don't sacrifice animals anymore. And right, but people have all kinds of perceptions and, you know, agree or disagree for a variety of reasons. But Jews today are rabbinic Jews. There are still some Karaites in the world, right, who read the text literally and don't believe in the commentary, but they don't identify as Jews. They identify as Karaites. From my understanding, that's my understanding.
Is that a good place to call it, Pastor James?
Yeah, I think you've left me with a question. Is it Sabbath or excuse? Like, I mean, maybe where to leave it is just we haven't resolved our question, but hopefully I've learned a lot, and so thank you for joining us, especially Rabbi. But you know, we're still left with the question of how do we do Sabbath in the 21st century in our different contexts. And if you're hoping for an easy answer to that, at least for my part, I didn't give a good one. So.
I'll tell you what I'm looking forward to is my Sabbath. I'm calling it retirement. I'm going to find a nice cat shelter. I'm going to volunteer there Tuesdays and Thursdays.
If you want a cat shelter nearby, I have a congregant who does just that.
Maybe in
specifically for like FIV positive, cats. So, yes, they volunteer regularly. That's how I learned about it. But I'd like to thank both of you for having me. This was fun. I laughed a lot more than I expected to with the topic.
We usually have fun in our theology.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we hope you'll join us next week on Theology Thursday.